Hello, I'm Ruske. Welcome to Reclaim Democracy. Tonight's show will focus on the 2004 vote. The voting process is the very foundation of democracy. If it functions well, the same might be said for the democratic process. Tonight we have Paul Lado, who is an attorney practicing in business law and consumer fraud. He's written a detailed study on the election irregularities in Snohomish County, Washington. So Paul, what got you interested in doing a study on the vote?
Well, I was one of the so-called army of 17,000 lawyers that was out there on election day, whose purpose wasn't necessarily to launch any litigation, but just to help make sure everybody that has the right to vote could actually exercise the right to vote. And since I was working for the Democratic Party, we were supposed to be placed in precincts that trended Democratic. So even though we're helping everybody, you know, there's also a selfish part of it, and that is that we'll probably get assist more Democratic voters than we would Republican voters. But in any event, in the precincts where I was at, there were electronic touchscreen voting machines. And I was surprised, since I stayed around after the polls were closed and they printed out the results tapes off of those, to see that Republicans had in fact won every race they possibly could, except for the ones that were not even contested on each one of the machines. So I was quite surprised by that. And when I looked at the paper vote and found out that the Democrats had done substantially better on the absentee vote, I started to take a look at that, and I thought that there might be something going on there. Of course, you know, it could be political factors. There can always be a really heavy get out the vote program by the Democrats, and certainly, you know, they did try to get the vote out in the absentee votes. However, since the absentee votes were more than 2/3 of the total vote, it's really hard for either the Democrats or the Republicans to totally swamp a sample that's that large. So then we really started to take a look at what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So definitely there was the lights and the bells going off there, and it sounded like, wow, something might be a little bit, I don't know, maybe fishy there. Maybe you could spend some time and talk about and summarize essentially the findings of your study.
Okay. Well, first of all, the first reaction that everybody has, when there's a question about an election is there's always reason after reason that's brought up. It could have been this. It could have been that. And but what actually happens is somebody says, well, it could have been a late surge for Rossi, or it could have been that his TV in the last week was more effective than Gregoire's or something like that. And that's true. It could have been that, but that doesn't mean that you stop investigating. But that's exactly what people use these shoulda, coulda, wouldas for, and what they function as is to stop people from looking at it, whether they mean to or not. I mean, it just works that way. So realizing that what we were seeing here could potentially be a phenomenal late surge, or it could be fraud, what we do is we go in, including my brother-in-law, Dr. Jeffrey Hoffman, that assisted me on the study, and try to examine, what are the whether it's, in fact, political factors that explain it, or whether there's machine malfunctions or fraud, or perhaps a combination of both, and try to separate those out. Because, I mean, if the fraud or the machine malfunction is so huge, like there was one machine in Ohio that registered negative 25 million votes, it's really obvious. I mean, everybody knows that that's wrong, and usually, but not always, that can be corrected. However, when it's in the less than 10% range or something like that, then it looks just like a normal voting pattern, and so you have a problem teasing out. But then that's what the goal of our study was, is to tease out fraud or irregularity or malfunction from the politics of it. And there were several ways that we did that. And first of all, we went through, and I won't go through them all here. People can read the study if they want to see the analysis. But we went through all the normal political factors and found that all of them were either not an explanation at all, or was at best a weak explanation, perhaps explaining a few hundred or votes difference. But what we actually saw is that with the absentee votes being 2/3 of the total vote, and then electronic just being the remaining 1/3, that Gregoire was ahead by 2,000 votes through all those paper ballots. And then in the last less than 1/3, Rossi wins by 8,000 or more than 8,000 votes for a net win of more than 6,000 votes.
Once again, a lot of, this is an indicator here that something is possibly wrong. Okay.
Yeah, so, something's wrong, and so then what we wanted to do is, like I said, separate those factors out. And the way we did that is by looking at how voting differs from random behavior. And what we found is that even though the Republican votes were bell curves, you know, we did our statistics with the help of Dr. Hoffman, and the Democrats' votes for Gregoire were a bell curve. When it came to the touch screens for the same election, same candidates, and oftentimes on the same day, because there's a lot of absentee ballots that are cast on election day, instead of being a bell curve, it was this double peaked curve. There was one peak that kind of matched the regular bell curve, and then there's this other peak over here that gives Rossi the 8,000 vote win.
Could you explain that curve just a little bit more so everyone in the audience could understand exactly what you're talking about there?
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, like my brother-in-law, Dr. Hoffman, has done manufacturing process control. And if something's going across a manufacturing line and it's forming a bell curve, if you suddenly saw it forming a different shaped curve, you would say there's something wrong in the process. We don't know what it is, but there's something wrong in the process. So when we saw the curve, the Republican curve, change from a bell curve to a twin peak curve in the same election, same race and everything, we know that there's something affecting the touch screens that is not affecting the paper ballots.
Yeah. So once again, just to say that, it's definitely specific to the touch screen machines, nothing that has a paper ballot, nothing that has a voter.
And it's also only present over part of the county. Because if it was present, like if there was a 4% surge over the entire county, you would just see the curve shifting like a mountain moving all at once. Okay. But what you're seeing is you're seeing the curve change shape. Okay, so it's, if it is a natural force, it's only acting on a very small part of the county, or it's fraud or malfunction acting on a small portion of the machines. And what we found, in fact, is I was able to find the machines that actually malfunctioned by serial number whenever we could. We added up the votes of the malfunctioning machines, and for example, we found out that Rossi got 50% more votes than Gregoire did on malfunctioning machines. And the key thing there is that, I was talking earlier about the political factors. You can't possibly say that Republicans or Democrats are attracted to malfunctioning machines unless you're a comic and you just want to make a joke. So because they're all, visibly identical on the outside. So we felt that this was some solid evidence that there was either serious malfunctions that happened to favor one party, or that there was an irregularity or fraud that favored one party.
To me, you've got wonderful proof. Now, that's all in this area. Could you kind of relate that to the rest of the country more? I know, earlier on you were speaking about, well, Ohio is this, now you've done this huge detailed study in Snohomish. What about the rest of the country?
Well, we did the Snohomish study sort of in response to how the whole country, the national debate had gone. Because what you start out with is exit polls showing John Kerry winning. And
on a national level?
On a national level, and especially in the swing states. And also the exit polls showing that John Kerry would have a popular vote victory. That's not the results by any stretch that were actually announced. So based on that, some people say, well, that doesn't prove anything. The exit polls don't prove anything. But what it does definitively establish is that there's something to investigate here. And to this date, there's been no official investigation of the vote or the exit polls of any kind. In fact, the exit poll data is just being withheld, and any attempts to investigate the elections are being resisted for the most part. But anyway, you have this discrepancy that shows Kerry wins, but the elections say Bush, and there's a lot of investigation and studies that went into that. One of the initial studies was a study in Florida showing that that the differences in voting patterns in Florida were related to the type of voting technology that people were using. But then people said, well, that's apples and oranges. Those are different counties. Okay, and so the reason I wanted to work on the Snohomish County was to try to resolve that debate, because in Snohomish County, you've got touchscreens and paper ballots used side by side in the same precincts and everything, and so that's why we wanted to help relate it to the national debate by having it in the same place.
In essence, it's giving you a very good comparison study between the two different machines, you're saying?
Right, it's giving you, since you're talking in the same precinct, you're talking about the same people, and the only main difference between them is whether they're voting on paper or whether they're voting touchscreen. Okay. They should be pretty close, but then what we saw is the touchscreens voted anywhere from 10 to almost 30% more Republican than the paper ballots did.
Mm. You know, I also read somewhere else in your report that there was a high correlation with machines that had been worked on as well. Is that, maybe you could speak of that as well? Machines
Yeah.
have been worked on earlier on.
Well, we tried to look at any kind of intervention that might possibly explain what it was. So we looked at malfunctions. We also looked at machines that had recently been serviced, and specifically not just serviced, but had their CPUs worked on. And that could be one of two things. It could be that either there are malfunctioning machines that just continue to malfunction no matter how much they're fixed, quote unquote, or it could be that, you know, there was something wrong with the servicing itself. And those serviced machines also had a trend to affect the vote in a Republican direction, and it wasn't. It was similar to the malfunctioning machines.
Okay. You know, I find the whole notion of exit polling and the fact that it's coming up pretty interesting. I mean, it seems to me that exit polling up until, say, 2000, or some would say 2004, was very accurate. First off, am I wrong in my assumption there, or was it accurate?
No, it is very accurate. I mean, exit polls have been used to predict elections all over the world, and under standard election monitoring protocols, if there's a difference between the exit poll and the election, that's an indication of possible fraud.
Maybe real quick, exactly how is an exit poll done?
Well, an exit poll is done by selecting random and bellwether precincts and interviewing the people that come out. And because you eliminate all uncertainty as to who they voted for and whether they're going to show up at the polls, they're much more accurate than regular polls. They're not where you don't know if these people are actually going to vote, or if they're going to get sick, or change their mind. So exit polls are a lot more accurate, and that's why they've talked about not releasing it, because people on the West Coast, you remember from years ago, talking about, let's not release these because people on the West Coast won't vote because we'll already know.
Okay. Now that kind of makes some sense to me, but why is it now we're hearing this talk of, well, my goodness, the exit polls aren't accurate anymore? Why are we hearing talk of, you know, maybe we shouldn't air these polls?
Well, it's a good question. You know, Zogby has called for a blue ribbon panel to be formed to investigate.
And Zogby is?
John Zogby is one of the biggest pollsters in the country, who's historically been most accurate, but he wasn't accurate in this past election. He predicted Kerry would win at 5 o'clock.
Isn't this probably the only time he hasn't been accurate? I thought I read something about he's been almost an international in doing pollsters, and this is the first one that hasn't worked out for him, essentially.
Well, yeah, this is the first one where he's been way wrong, quote unquote, and so he's concerned that, you know, he realizes that either the election or the polls are wrong, and he needs to find out in order to, you know, to show, you know, how he should improve his professional skills if he's the one that's wrong.
Why are they wrong?
Well,
has anybody offered that up besides Zogby? You know, why these polls are wrong nowadays?
Well, they're not wrong all across the board. See, the thing is that Utah went heavily for Bush, but the polls were right on for Utah. The polls were right on in other states that don't use various types of electronic machinery, or they were much closer to being accurate and within the normal tolerances. Whereas where you're using in the battleground states especially, that's where the exit polls didn't work, supposedly.
So this is phenomenal to me. We're saying here that exit polls only function where there's no paper trail. There's no way for a voter to actually prove how they voted. That exit polling is no longer functioning where there's the quote-unquote black box voting. Actually, maybe you could explain black box voting just real quickly too. I don't want to.
Well, the idea of a black box voting is if you vote into a machine, you can't necessarily know how your vote is actually being registered because it's being done on an invisible electronic area. So they call that inside the black box. So that's where you get black box voting.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to throw out there about what you found in your study? Something that was really a big eye-opener?
Well, I think you know, there are many things, and I think it's, you know, worth reading for anybody that can stand just a little bit of light mathematics that are in there and stuff like that. But another interesting thing is that all of the machines are required to have their power cords daisy chained, so they're connected to each other in a network. And so we had to examine, and there is data to suggest that where one machine malfunctions, it's able to affect the other machines, and it may be through the mechanism of the power cords. And we also show that as of last year, you know, the FCC approved a language for all household goods to communicate with each other through the electrical network in your house. So basically, electrical lines are now networks. So if you want to have a secure election, you need to have a firewall against your electrical thing, or else somebody that knows what they're doing, and it's not really that fancy, can tap into the computer, through the electrical wire.
I've heard the name Sequoia. Is that just Sequoia machines, or is that all? I know there's a lot of different companies that do this. Do you know about how many, and how many use, let's say, a less secure process?
Well, none of the companies are particularly secure. I mean,
None of the companies?
Yeah, the computer security experts like Avi Rubin have not found any of them to be good.
Do you know offhand what kind of percentage we're looking at for, say, Snohomish and the rest of the country, percent-wise, where they use touchscreens that don't have a verifiable voter trail? And
well, 98 million people voted on electronic voting machines, and I don't know exactly what percentage that works out to, but it's pretty high. Not all of those are touch screens, but all of them lack a sufficient paper trail to make it clear.
So any way you look at it, 98 million votes aren't, they're not provable. There's no hard facts on them. There's no trail on them, nothing like that. Oh, goodness, it's kind of big. Now, I know that you're involved in a lawsuit. Could you talk about that a little bit, maybe?
Well, after looking at all of the fraud issues and irregularities and malfunctions, and then engaging in the national debate about what to do about it, why isn't the media covering it, all these other kinds of issues, we just decided that there's a fundamental problem with the secrecy of vote counting, no matter who does it, and especially if a corporation like Sequoia does it. But in other words, even though our ballots are supposed to be secret so we don't disclose who we vote for and then get retaliated against, the counting of the ballots has always been a public process that everybody had the right to observe, or at the very least all political parties had the right to have an observer there to make sure that everything's on the up and up. But what happens when people sell electronic voting equipment to the government is they sign a contract, and that contract typically contains a trade secret clause and says, our software program and everything that actually counts the votes is secret, and you're going to cooperate with us in keeping it secret. But so I realized that what that actually means is that the counting of our vote has been privatized. And it is now not subject to any observation by any citizen, or really even the government officials.
The thing is, though, earlier on you said that isn't legal. You're saying even though it's not legal, it's been privatized by corporations?
In my opinion, yeah.
In my opinion. Now, is that just a state thing? Is that a county thing? Is that a national thing?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, it's present in the contracts of all companies that sell voting equipment, because it's a relatively standard corporate software type of a thing. However, the problem is when you take corporate rules and then try to apply them to the core of our democracy. If you want to take trade secrets and then apply it to a process that is supposed to be totally open and public, that's the problem. So, people can debate whether trade secrets should or should not be protected. All I'm saying in the lawsuit is that if you want secrets, go back to the private sector and get out of the government. Because the government is a place for openness and transparency and democracy. It's not a place for keeping secrets, particularly secrets about the counting of the vote. You can perhaps have secrets in national defense, but this is something that is designed to be open, and that's the counting of the vote. Because ultimately, if the loser of the election isn't confident that the result was reached by a fair process, ultimately democracy would completely fail, because the consent of the governed would be lost. It would be considered a joke, not an election.
Okay, that's definitely serious to me. How do you, or let's say, what are you going to achieve? What do you hope to achieve through this lawsuit? What's the next step?
Well, we'll be filing within a few days, and what we will ask a court to do is to declare that the contract is either as a whole invalid, or at least the provisions that purport to make our vote counting secret are invalid. And that's basically what we want to do, is cancel out that contract. And if we cancel out the whole contract, we'll ask the court, since the contract's been canceled, to refund all or a portion of the money that the county paid, which was about $5 million for these either defective or fraudulent machines, that privatized our vote. Because right now for the government to take this action itself, it's signed a contract and it would be sued by Sequoia, and there's a $5 million incentive not to do anything, because then you'd have to explain how you lost this $5 million, see? So there's a lot of pressure being put on our individual jurisdictions around the country to keep this private vote counting secret.
You know, maybe I'm a little bit confused here. Why in the first place did, you know, our elected officials, whoever, decide to buy these particular machines? I mean, if there's a problem, maybe you could elaborate that a little bit more.
Well, I think there's two reasons why they bought them without considering the kinds of things we're talking about today. I think one is that they focus basically on convenience, because Americans love convenience, and we want fast election results. And because we want fast election results, sometimes corners get cut, and maybe democracy gets killed while seeking fast election results. And the other reason is because there's just this general idea that technology just keeps getting better and better. But there are a lot of people that are real experts in computers and don't hate computers in any sense of the word, think that computers are great, but not for counting votes. That's just one. There are weaknesses to computers as well as strengths, and we have to realize that just because they're good, it doesn't mean they go everywhere. And so, but those two things, you know, focusing on the power of technology and convenience, cause them to ignore the real purpose of an election in democracy, and that is the loser has to accept that the process was fair, and the public, every voter, has the right to observe and realize that it's fair. And so they forgot about those two purposes.
Well, it's a shame they've forgotten about that. It seems to have affected a lot. How about real quickly, who owns these companies? And maybe if you know of this, do they have vested interest anywhere in maybe the process of voting? I don't want you to speculate in any way, but...
Well, all of the main voting companies are controlled by multinational or national corporations. Let's just talk about Sequoia.
Okay.
Sequoia is owned by De La Rue, which is a British-based multinational. Basically what De La Rue has for clients is 150 countries because it prints their currencies. It's also a leader in national ID cards. So they deal in very secret, high security, sensitive type things, and then now they've gotten into the voting industry, which is not supposed to be secret, but that's how that's being applied to us. Just by the way, De La Rue also got a contract from the U.S. Defense Department in 2003 to print the Iraqi currency. So they also have the U.S. government as a recent customer. And they continue to, do things in Iraq, like lead trade shows and stuff like that. So, regardless of whether you're a Republican who's maybe concerned about foreign influence of 150 countries, or whether you're a Democrat and you're concerned about conflicts of interest with Bush administration contracts, it's a mess, no matter which way you look at it, and yet it's never been disclosed that the people that have control over the private counting of our votes are, objectionable probably to both parties.
Oh, my goodness. There's so many problems with the vote now. How about maybe take a little bit of time, a couple minutes, and design the perfect voting system that our principles of democracy can function on? I mean, what would be that system?
Well, I think that because each person has the right to vote, and that actually came before our government was ever formed, each person with that right...
Is it a fundamental right, just out of curiosity?
Yes, it is. I mean, an inalienable right. And that's, when we say we, the people, formed the government, it's because these things existed before the limited government was ever formed. And so voting's not a privilege that can be regulated readily. It's a right that you cannot burden unless, there's a severe justification for that. The right to vote is also a protection against tyranny, and that's why I think we're wrong in taking away felons' rights to vote, because it's not because we want to give gifts to people that have broken the law.
Once again, it's just in certain states, correct?
Just in certain states, and sometimes some states it's permanent, in other states it just ends when the sentence ends. But anyway, if a government can imprison a certain minority of people and take away their right to vote, they can consolidate their power that way just by simply by the act of putting people in jail. So in order to protect against tyranny, I mean, I think the original intent really is to have everybody the right to vote, so that way if too many people are getting put in jail and the country's becoming a tyranny, there's a little bit of a check against that. So, but there are various reasons that we have to take the right to vote seriously as part of our freedom. And so the perfect system involves something that the average person can understand, something that the average person can verify, and something the average person can see or the government can prove is accurate.
Is there a place for corporations to function in that, or is that not a possibility with proprietary software? Is there a way we can deal with that?
Well, there can be a limited function for corporations, but not a major function where they basically control the vote. Because basically, if you were my friend and I asked you to count the votes in some election for me, that would be a corrupt relationship that I would be trying to develop with you, because nobody should trust somebody's friend who's also a candidate or whatever to control the vote. It has to be a public, open process that everybody can see. So because of the reasons I stated earlier, I think there should be paper ballots, and they should be hand counted. And if there's just in really populated areas, you can have some of them machine counted with a scanner while hand counters operate on site. And if they come up with different results, then we know there's a problem either with the scanner or with the hand counters. But everybody can understand that kind of a system and accept the result if they lose. Even though I think it might be technologically possible, certainly not with anything we have today, but it might be technologically possible to have a computer system do it all. It would be, number one, too complicated. Non-technical people couldn't understand it, and because they couldn't understand it, they can't be forced to have faith in it, and therefore it doesn't work in a democracy.
You know, once again, it sounds like the real problem here isn't necessarily, well, I guess it is with the vote, but only because corporate personhood, or let's say the civil rights of corporations, have gotten involved in it. You know, we did appear to have the legal structure necessary to protect the voting process, but somehow or another that has been changed or affected for the benefit of corporations, or maybe for the benefit of, you know, having a very expedient vote count, something like that.
Well, it kind of shows how freedom of contract has come in, and through one contract they privatize the voting process. So it's kind of a corporate contract problem, and they were able to take away they were able to get something they could never get through an act of the legislature or through Congress. And if a foreign nation took over our vote counting and said, we don't want to take over your airports, just your vote counting, that's all we want, we would still consider that an act of war. But they were able to accomplish it just through a contract because of freedom of contract.
We have about 30 seconds. Anything else you want to say to close it up?
Well, if people are interested in more information about either the lawsuit or the voter study, I would suggest going to votersunite.org. They are hosting the study. There's no direct connection with me, but they've agreed to help distribute the study. And I think that people need to say that, and maybe instead of reclaim democracy, we should call it we claim democracy, as in we the people. We the people need our elections. They need to be open and fair.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that help.
I've never seen a time when my voice was all mine. Somebody bought the vote and my voice got left behind. Well, I think it's time we rein the animal in and give the voice back to democracy. Give the voice back to democracy. Took my vote away. Well, he greased the palms that took the Bill of Rights away. And I remember the freedom for which we fought and paid. And well, it's time to reclaim time, to reclaim time, to reclaim democracy. Oh.